All right, well, why don't we get started? Because we're starting to get a fuller house here. So good morning to everyone, or good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. Can I just get validation that you can see the introductory slide with all the Post-it notes, inclusive content strategy? Can someone just confirm in the chat that you are seeing that? Wonderful, thank you. All right, well, we're so glad to have you here today. My name is Allison Manley. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Canopy. And today, of course, we're hosting a webinar about inclusive content strategy. Canopy Studios designs and builds and supports websites for clients that want to make a positive impact. And just to give you some quick info about AmyJune, she is our community ambassador, and as such, she keeps our team connected to the open source communities of both WordPress and Drupal. She does training, speaking, volunteering, mentoring, collaborating at camps and cons across the nation. And she is also an avid Volkswagen enthusiast, which is why if you follow her on all the social, her name is Volkswagen Chick. So that's where you can find her. A reminder that there's a Q&A button there in the bottom of your screen. So anytime throughout the presentation, if you have a question, please enter it there. And when she's done, we'll address them all at the end. So from here, I'm going to turn off my video and mute and turn it over to you, AmyJune.
Thanks, Allison, for the introduction. Because this is an inclusive space, we are running some live transcriptions through Thyssen. Allison's going to post the link in chat. So if captioning or live transcriptions is something that you can benefit from, you can click on the link and you should be able to see me talking and any questions that are asked, that kind of thing. Like Allison said, we're going to talk about inclusive content strategy today. This is fifth in the series that we have for our winter webinar series. Excuse me. In a couple of weeks, we have Randy talking about reorganizing your navigation for success, if you want to check out the last one in that series. I want to start off with this quote from Barack Obama. He says, "We are at a time in our country's history that inclusive language is better than exclusive language." And I've had this slide up on my decks for quite some time. And I just think that he captures the idea so well. First off, I want to acknowledge where I'm presenting today. I'm in Northern California on Ohlone lands. So I just want to make mention that I like to acknowledge the traditional ancestral territory which I present on. Like Allison said, my name is AmyJune. She gave all the little things about me. I use the pronouns she and her. And I am a hospice nurse by trade, so it gives me a little bit different perspective in tech. Because when I first entered tech and I realized that folks could make their websites accessible, but they choose not to, that was kind of a weird thing for me. So it sort of opened up the doors in the niche that I like to be in as far as like accessibility and inclusiveness. So what is inclusion? You know, we really have to think about it. It's really, really multifaceted. And hopefully at the end of this presentation, it'll give you a better an idea of how different people feel about inclusion, because there's inclusion on the personal level, there's inclusion on the community level, and of course there's inclusion on the global level too, especially now that we're all sort of virtual. You know, the world's really opening up to be, you know, it's a world stage now. And remember, inclusion can mean different things to different people. Oops, sorry, a little trigger happy there. Let's talk about some of the differences between diversity and inclusion though. Sometimes those two concepts can be lumped together and many folks think that they're the same thing. But they aren't. You know, in the workplace, diversity really equals representation. You know, without inclusion, though, those connections that we strive to build just aren't there. You know, the things that attract talent, encourage and foster participation from your team, and the business growth that happens with diversity. If you don't have that inclusion, it doesn't happen. Diversity is more focused on tracking things like characteristics and identities. It's meant for inviting people who have previously been excluded, you know, on things like gender or tribe, caste, ability, orientation, age, any of those characteristics that people can be labeled with. It really refers to, and this is on the slide, it refers to the vast array of differences, where inclusion refers to the intent of the individuals or organizations and systems and agencies to actively include and support those differences. To sum it up, inclusion is about welcoming and embracing that diversity because of all of those benefits that I mentioned. It amplifies those historically excluded, some people will call it more marginalized, but those folks are traditionally excluded. It helps amplify those voices and ideas. Inclusion exercises diversity. It's a conversation that's deepened by diversity. Another quote I really like is from Verna Myers. She says that diversity is being invited to the party where inclusion is being asked to dance. Again, because diversity alone doesn't drive inclusion. And often if that inclusion isn't there, there's a diversity backlash and those people will leave. I read a blog article one time and this quote stuck with me, that diversity is when you count the people and inclusion is when the people count. And it really comes down to the difference between being tolerated and being celebrated for your part in society. So let's look at what does it mean to have meaningful content in our digital assets? We have to think about who our readers are. Of course, we have target audiences for some people, for some of our content, but really most of the copy that we produce and advertise should be meant for everyone. And meaningful content has many nuances, it really boils down to making sure that our content doesn't make assumptions about folks, because those assumptions can really create barriers. We shouldn't assume a person's political stance. We shouldn't assume their socioeconomic class. We shouldn't assume anyone's abilities. And remember, as we get older, everyone becomes more disabled with time. Our hearing and our eyesight deteriorate, our body aches. We don't use our bodies the same way we did when we were young. I recently had ear surgery to get my eardrum replaced. And what a surreal experience that was, not being able to hear out of one ear. It made me really think about how important captioning is when we think about including everyone in our content. But there's other things like people recovering from LASIK surgery, using a smartphone in the bright sun. Some folks just have black and white printers, with no color. So there's all different things that we think about when we make our content meaningful. And we have to remember that not all disabilities can be seen. Like, you can't tell that I have hearing loss. So there's debilitating pain, fatigue, dizziness, brain injuries, mental health disorders, learning differences, cognitive dysfunctions, as well as what a lot of people associate with disabilities being hearing and vision impairments. Other common assumptions that folks made are around someone's gender identity, sexuality, and their pronouns. Gender and sex and sexual identity are all very different things. So we all need to be aware of our language that we use around pronouns as well. About 6 months ago, there's sort of this movement where we're trying to get away from saying things like preferred pronouns, because they're not my preferred pronouns, they're just my pronouns. So looking at the way we use the language around identifying people too is super important. So inclusive language, let's take a little bit more refined look at inclusive language. Increasing the inclusivity, excuse me, take a drink. Increasing the inclusivity of our language means really getting to understand the ways that people make unconscious assumptions about people when they use that language. Language can unintentionally reinforce dominant norms around things like gender, race, class, tribe, caste, sexual orientation. We want to be mindful that we only reference personal attributes or characteristics when it's relative to the context that we're using it in. Ableist language, for those unfamiliar, this is words or phrases that devalue people who live with disabilities. Most of the time it's inadvertent, but ableist language suggests that people with disabilities are abnormal or have less worth than other folks. So we want to use people first language, use people with disabilities instead of disabled. And the next slide, I have some ableist language that we might not think about, that we might use in everyday language. But going back to that people first language, we want to make sure that we use language that people prefer too, because whereas some people prefer, that person first language, other communities like the deaf community really want to just say deaf or blind. So make sure that you use the language that people prefer. People with disabilities over, the disabled. A good example would be people living with HIV rather than AIDS victims. People who use wheelchairs over crippled or wheelchair bound. And another thing that I found common in the workplace is we use these descriptive words like crazy or dumb or even lame. But using the word crazy might seem really harmless, but giving negative value to words like crazy or insane can marginalize folks. OCD is a good example. That's obsessive compulsive disorder. It's a rather common term that people use a lot, and it can be really hurtful. Obsessive compulsive disorder is really a mental illness that means so much more than just a knack for organization. It's an obstacle that some folks live with every day. So we want to make sure that we use words like clean or organized instead. There's a list here, and Allison will share the deck with folks who attended the webinar. But this list here, I invite you to look at these words and then do some research about things that you can use as an alternative. Another aspect of inclusive language is gendered language. We want to make sure that our words are gender neutral. We want to use words that encompass all genders rather than just two. And some places that we need to think about this is, our use of nouns, titles and names, and pronouns. Because it's simply not okay anymore to introduce or address folks from diverse groups with gendered words. The words may seem benign, but if someone's annoyed or bothered, when some people will use the word guys, then the polite thing to do is to call them by something else. There's all kinds of alternatives. You can say folks or people or you're all instead of guys. There's another list here of all different kinds of things. I'll just do a couple of examples. Instead of using the word manned, like manned the booth, you could use something like staff or handled. Instead of using women and men or ladies and gentlemen, you can say everyone. Instead of doing boys and girls, using the word children. Same thing with brothers and sisters, using the word siblings or kindred, or father and mother, using parents or even guardians, because not everyone who takes care of children is a mother or father or parent, so be very mindful of using gender specific words. And our language is littered with symbolism of white as positive and black as negative, so I want to talk a little bit about racial undertones. Cultural racism, using the words like culturally deprived or economically disadvantaged or underdeveloped, or even like third world. It puts things in sort of a superior frame. So be very mindful, because we just want to make sure that we don't hurt anybody, Then here's another list, and when Allison shares the slide decks, these are links with some pretty good resources about where these phrases came from, where they originate, and how they can be harmful. So again, I'm just going to give a couple of examples, but using the word colored when describing people. we don't do that anymore. You know, let's use people of color because it's a more widely accepted umbrella term that includes any white person or any non-white person, sorry. This is one of my favorite examples because I used it a lot historically, is gypped. It comes from the word gypsy, which refers to Romanian people who are often unfairly characterized as swindlers. You know, ghetto is suspected to be derived from an Italian slang word for waste. And if we think back from World War II times, you know, they used the word ghetto when they talked about concentration camps. It's also in the recent decades been used to label neighborhoods that traditionally excluded or marginalized peoples are forced to inhabit due to social and economic disadvantage, you know? So using a word like ghetto can really call in classism and racism. There's also the idea of privilege when it comes to our language. You know, we want to make sure we use language that does not assume a certain level of education. You know, for example, we shouldn't assume that all people have graduated from high school or will go to college or will graduate from college. You know, so we want to make sure that we also use language that doesn't assume a certain level of financial means or certain sort of vocation as well. You know, you might be giving a webinar or a talk, and not everyone present may have a stable living condition. You know, they might not have the luxury of working a first shift job, you know? So when we use things like real job and honest living, that can be problematic by discriminating other sects of the labor force. And remember, I talked about, you know, as the internet opens up to more people, we enter that realm of having a world stage. So English as a second language can be a privilege and a situational privilege as well. And that's something to think about when we think about the folks who consume our content. And that's one of the reasons I like providing transcriptions, and someone whose native language might not be English can benefit from seeing the words. It's okay to admit to our past self that we weren't equipped with sufficient knowledge, you know, and the easiest thing to do is to move forward. So we as content authors or editors or designers and even coders need to really look beyond the empathy and have pragmatic solutions that include every community as participants when we think about our content strategy. You know, everyone is really hungry to be part of the process and the creation of the world. And everyone wants to be seen as equal participants and not as afterthoughts. So I want to take a little bit of a look at certain kinds of copy, and they might not be relevant for everyone, but it might spark a little bit of an idea of some of the concepts I'm talking about. With Canopy, we work with some higher ed institutions. So I want to look at student admission pages. You know, some folks here might be part of the higher ed world as well. We want to make sure when we look at our student pages that we don't have any sort of stereotype threat. And stereotype threat refers to kind of confirming the negative stereotypes around an individual's race, cultural group, or ethnic identity, or even gender. You know, we also want to make sure that we think about tokenism. You know, tokenism gives the illusion of equality without actually achieving it. And I'm going to quote Merriam-Webster here. Tokenism is the practice of doing something, such as hiring a person who belongs to a minority group, only to prevent criticism and give the appearance that people are actually treated fairly. So with saying that, make sure your imagery aligns with your population. And again, only refer to people's personal attributes when it's relevant to the context. Hiring practices, you know, you might work for an agency that has an HR department. And again, we're going to go back to looking at that people first aspect. Words used in tech job descriptions can oftentimes be skewed towards gendered interpretation and can even discourage some folks from even applying, you know, so we want to make sure, you know, we avoid gendered language and male-oriented titles like ninja or hacker. We also want to avoid using insider language in our job ads and our equal employment statements. We want to make sure that applicants or our own team don't feel excluded, so keep the language simple and straightforward. Don't expect people to know every aspect of your company's culture. You can also bring a little bit of compassion. This can go with student admission pages too. You can bring compassion to your job ads or your application pages by thinking about perks and benefits that matter to different types of people. Great, you have a beer keg and a ping pong table, but what about things like parental leave, comfortable workspaces for our friends who live with neurodiversity, and what about benefits for people who live with disabilities, and benefits that cover domestic partners as well. Code bases and archives, making sure we strip our code bases and documentation of harmful language, things like whitelist, blacklist, master, and she and her, perhaps using allow and deny list or block list instead of blacklist. Instead of a master branch, we have parent and child branches. And there's really no need to use pronouns anymore. You could say the user or they. Digital blackface, this is something that happens in social media quite a bit. Digital blackface refers to non-Black folks claiming Black identities online, or to non-Black folks using Black people's images and GIFs and memes to convey their own thoughts or emotions. And think back in history to folks who were on the stage dressed in blackface. We wouldn't tolerate that. And this is sort of that same degree. We need to ensure that same degree of no tolerance in our online spaces as well. People, white people specifically, using Black reaction gifs or memes is dangerous because they perpetuate some stereotypes that are often negative, sassiness or anger or excitement, and it turns Black emotions into comedies at the pleasure of white folks. If the problem really lies in the way that Black individuals have been and still are exploited by the media for humor. So now what? Having the information to move forward is valuable, but really, what can you do? If you have the privilege to change your language because you have the ability or the resources and the cognitive ability, consider being more aware about how you use your everyday language. Think about things that can perpetuate ableist, gendered, and racial ideas and values. This is a fortune cookie, a fortune, I pulled out of a fortune cookie a long time ago, and I use it all the time in all my different talks because it applies to so many things in life. Begin, the rest is easy. Because I don't know about you, but that first step is the hardest, saying thank you and moving on and just being mindful of the people around you and their reactions really helps, just because you've always done something one way doesn't mean you need to do it that way forever, so start by being a good example and ally, make sure our presentations and venues and copies are accessible, not only in the physical world, but the digital world. There are plenty of tools that will help with content. There's accessibility checkers, there's readability checkers. Many people add their pronouns to their public profiles now and email signatures to eliminate confusion. And oftentimes this helps normalize gender identities and conversations about them. I do want to mention call out culture. Calling out is the idea of publicly letting someone know when their values or their language don't align. Often people will call it shaming, public shaming. And this behavior can be really oppressive and often shuts people down. The shaming culture is amplified on the internet because of the ability to be anonymous when you post. They shut down conversations and make people fearful of being targeted. So I invite people to look at calling in. calling in can take the form of a private conversation or DM, and it can be really a time for education. You know, people make mistakes and they're often unaware that they caused harm. So calling in can be a more productive form of dialogue. And when someone corrects the misuse of their pronouns, you know, say thank you and not sorry, you know. Um, so just moving forward is a good thing. Content editors are active participants in the whole website cycle or our digital assets. You know, in many cases, our content authors or creators are in there far longer than our designers and our developers. So we just make sure that we train them in the same way we train our designers and our developers for accessibility. Um, you know, companies should really invest in training the content authors the same way we do our coders and designers. You know, we can set up our WYSIWYGs, you know, what you see is what you get, your content editors. So they're encouraged to be used. And you can make those accessible from the start, you know, by putting in tooltips, letting the editors know what all the different buttons do. And then editors can be trained in the importance of the structure and contrast and consistent use of links and themes and images throughout the website. And that really ties into the website accessibility part of inclusion. And then there's some quick links. There's Hemingway, you know, it includes readability levels, Grammarly checks copy for clarity, passive voice, acronyms, Tenon.io, and the list goes on. So again, you know, we're drawing real close to the end, but, you know, think about what inclusion means. You know, remember those 3 levels? There's the inclusion on the personal level, the community level, and the global level as well. And then, you know, it's doubtful you'll ever be called out for being too considerate, you know. Just throwing your language around and being oblivious to the way you communicate is a good way to lose your audience, you know, who might feel like you're really not talking to them, and they could be hurt by your message and then ultimately feel excluded. So if you can choose behavior that upsets people versus behavior that upsets no one, you know, defaulting to that upsetting no one makes a lot of sense. And again, if you have that cognitive and language privilege to adjust your language, consider becoming more aware of how your everyday language can perpetuate, you know, the negative things around ableist, gendered, racial values, racial ideas and values. So thank you. Like Allison said, you know, I am Volkswagen Chick across all the medias, and it looks like we have a little bit of time for questions. Allison?
So does anyone have any questions they want to put in the Q&A? Now is the time to do it with time decreasing. But I have a quick question just before we end, AmyJune. There is a lot here and it is a bit overwhelming, I would think, if people are seeing this for the first time. So what would you recommend is like the first 1 or 2 steps for people to make these changes?
So from the accessibility point of view, like being inclusive in the accessibility point of view, there are some like really good resources for your digital assets, like just to check for, you know, color contrast and that kind of thing. And there's that link on the slides for things like Tenon.io, which will check for gendered language. Mm-hmm. But, you know, really thinking about how there's no binary, I think is really important, you know, like just try to challenge people to think beyond what we've normally thought, you know, as times are changing and people are opening up more, you know, taking the time to find out why people are using different language is important, because then you can strive to like include that in your own base. I don't know, it's such a hard thing just to pick one thing to start on, of course, but you know, Google is your friend, you know, there's a list of links in there, like tipping point, like why is that not okay? You know, and in doing that, like link bumper car, you know, once you find one link and then you go to the link at the bottom and you find something else. I love doing that because you never know where you're going to end up.
All right, great. Well, we are at time. And so if there are no other questions, I will call it. Thank everyone for joining. I will be sending out the deck with all the links to the resources, hopefully by end of day tomorrow. And as a reminder, Canopy, of course, would love to help you with your website. If you need it, reach out to us at hello@canopy.com. And I hope you all have a really wonderful rest of your week. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.